The auction house sat on the 44th floor of the Caldwell Tower, and on the morning everything changed, it smelled like old money and fresh betrayal. Prudence Okafor had worked at Harwick and Sable Fine Art Auctioneers for 6 years, and in 6 years she had learned 3 things. That provenance was everything, that the wealthy lied constantly about where their art came from, and that no one in the building would ever look at her the way they looked at the paintings on the wall. She was 31 years old. She was 5'4" and 212 pounds, and she had a master's degree in art authentication from Columbia that her supervisor, a thin-lipped man named Sterling Price, had once referred to as impressive given the circumstances. She had never figured out what circumstances he meant. She suspected it was all of her, all at once. The morning it started, Prudence was in the back vault cataloguing a new acquisition, 14 pieces from the estate of a deceased Swiss collector named Helmut Bauer, when she found the first anomaly. It was a Flemish oil mid-17th century, attributed to a minor follower of Rembrandt. The documentation looked perfect. The provenance chain was clean going back 40 years. But there was something wrong with the craquelure, the fine network of cracks in the paint surface, and Prudence had been staring at craquelure since she was 23 years old. The cracks were too uniform, too deliberate. Like someone had studied how old paint aged and then aged it on purpose. She put down her loupe and looked at the other 13 paintings. 3 hours later, she had flagged 9 of the 14 as potentially fraudulent. She wrote it up in a careful, precise report and sent it to Sterling Price at 11:45 in the morning. By noon, Sterling had forwarded it, with his own name attached, to the partners. Prudence didn't find out until later. She was still in the vault when her phone buzzed with a text from the junior cataloguer, 2 floors up, a 24-year-old named Gwen, who wore her hair in 2 braids, and was one of the only people in the building who regularly said good morning. Sterling just walked into the partners' meeting with a folder. "He's taking credit for your Bauer analysis. Thought you should know." Prudence sat very still for a moment, her loupe in her hand, surrounded by 9 forged masterpieces. Then she kept working, because the work still needed doing, and because she already knew that this was not the part that mattered yet. What she did not know, what no one at Harwick and Sable knew, was that the Bauer collection had not arrived in New York by accident. Harwick and Sable had been chosen specifically. The pieces had been consigned by a holding company with 4 layers of shell corporations between it and its actual owner, and the actual owner had paid significant money to ensure that the auction house's most notable compliance weakness was its authentication department, which had been chronically understaffed since the previous head of department had left 18 months ago. The actual owner of the fraudulent Bauer collection was a man named Luciano Cavallo. He was 41 years old. He had been born in Chicago to a Sicilian father and an Irish mother, and he had his father's name and his mother's grey eyes and the particular quality of stillness that came from having spent 20 years in a world where showing too much of yourself could get you killed. He ran a private equity firm called Aldgate Capital that was legitimate enough to satisfy regulators and opaque enough to manage considerably less legitimate interests. He owned 17 properties across 4 countries, a 38-foot sailing yacht that he rarely used, and controlling interest in a medium-sized shipping company that moved things across borders that weren't always documented in the manifests. He was also, as of 11:53 that morning, reading an alert on his phone that told him an authentication report had been filed on the Bauer collection. His head of security, a compact, quiet man named Bowen, watched him read it. "Someone flagged 9 of the 14, Luciano said. "Yes, who?" Bowen checked his tablet. "Junior authenticator. Prudence Okafor, 6 years at the firm. Columbia graduate. Previous work. Did she send it up the chain?" "Yes." Her supervisor attached his name and submitted it. Luciano was quiet for a moment. "She flagged 9, yes. We thought 4 was the threshold." The best auditor on the West Coast looked at those pieces and missed 5 of them. Bowen said nothing. I need to know everything about Prudence Okafor, Luciano said, and his voice was very calm. And I need to understand whether she's a problem or an asset. The partners' meeting lasted 2 hours. Prudence found out it had happened when Sterling stopped by her desk at 4:30 and told her that the partners had decided to conduct an internal review of the Bauer collection, and that given the sensitivity of the matter, the work would be taken over by the senior authentication team. You did good work flagging it, he said in the tone of someone complimenting a dog for not biting the mailman. We'll note your contribution. I'd like to be part of the review, Prudence said. Sterling's expression shifted slightly, not quite discomfort, not quite contempt, something that lived in the space between them. We'll have our senior people handle it from here. You can get back to the quarterly inventory. I found 9 forgeries in 3 hours, Prudence said. With limited access to the files, if you give me the full provenance documentation on all 14 pieces, I can. Prudence. He said her name the way some people said enough. We appreciate the contribution. But the big picture is best left to the people who've been doing this a little longer, don't you think? She looked at him for a long moment. There was something that lived in her chest, coiled and patient. She had been carrying it for 6 years at this firm, and considerably longer before that. Every performance review that said good work, but every conference table she wasn't invited to, every time someone nodded along while she was speaking and then turned to ask the man next to her the same question, as if they needed a translation. She picked up her pen and her notepad. Of course, she said. I'll get back to the inventory. She stayed until 8 o'clock that night. The office had emptied by 6, and she sat in the vault with the junior cataloger's access credentials. Gwen had offered them without being asked, with the casual solidarity of someone who had watched too many times, and she went through every piece of documentation in the Bauer file. What she found was not just forgeries. What she found was a system. The same shell company structure appeared in 3 other consignments Harwick and Sable had processed in the past 2 years. Different names, different estates, different nationalities of deceased collector. But the same pattern in the documentation, the same law firm in Luxembourg. She had to look at it twice to be sure. A company called Straight Pacific Logistics. She photographed everything on her personal phone. She was about to leave when the elevator at the end of the corridor opened, and 4 men walked out who did not look like they worked at an auction house. The man in front was tall, dark-suited, grey-eyed. He moved through the space like he had already measured it and found it manageable. Behind him 3 men who were clearly security, in the way that mountains are clearly not furniture. Luciano Cavallo stopped 10 feet from Prudence Okafor and looked at her. She looked back. Miss Okafor, he said. You're working late. She had spent 6 years learning to read auction rooms, to watch bidders' hands, to read the micro-expressions that crossed wealthy faces when a lot came up that they wanted badly but didn't want anyone to know they wanted. She read him the way she read rooms. He was not surprised to find her here. He had come here because she was here. You're not a client, she said. No, you're connected to the Bauer collection. Something shifted in his face, very small, very fast. Why would you say that? Because the only people who would know I was here at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday are people who were watching either the building or my accounts. The Bauer file is the only active case sensitive enough to warrant that kind of attention, and you're standing in my authentication vault without a visitor badge, which means either security let you up or security works for you. She paused. Also, you have the same grey eyes as the man in the photograph attached to the Aldgate capital registration documents. Luciano Cavallo was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Bowen, he said, without looking away from her, give us the room. Bowen and the other 2 men retreated to the elevator corridor, which left Prudence alone in a locked building with a man who, she was fairly certain, had just confirmed that he was the source of 9 forged masterpieces currently sitting in her vault. She kept her face very still. You're not afraid, he said. It was not a question. It was more like something he was cataloguing. I'm a lot of things right now, Prudence said. Afraid is in there, but I've been dismissed enough times today that the other feelings are doing most of the talking. He looked at her for a moment, and it was a different kind of looking than she was used to. Not the quick scan and depist she got from Sterling Price, not the polite non-seeing of the partners who passed her in the hallway. He was actually looking at her, like she was a problem he needed to understand completely before he made a single move. You found 9, he said. The other 5 have more sophisticated forgeries. If you give me another 4 hours and the full shipping manifests, why would I do that? Because you already know I found 9, which means you know I'm good enough to be dangerous to you. So the only question is what I'm going to do with what I know. And I think you came here tonight to make a decision about that. And what decision do you think I'm weighing? Prudence folded her hands on top of the notepad in her lap. Whether I'm a threat to eliminate or a resource to acquire. The room was very quiet. Most people, Luciano said slowly, in the position you're in right now, would be trying to negotiate their safety. I'm not in a position, Prudence said. I copied everything I found tonight onto a cloud storage account with a time-released send function. If I don't enter a code in the next 14 hours, everything goes to the FBI's art crime team, the New York DA's financial crimes unit, and 3 journalists I've met at industry conferences who cover white-collar fraud. She let that sit for a moment. So you're not here to make a decision about my safety. You're here because you don't actually have the option to eliminate me without significant consequences, and you need to figure out what I want. Another silence. Longer this time, then Luciano Cavallo did something she had not expected. He sat down, not in a negotiating posture, not in the way someone sits to establish dominance. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat like someone who had just found a room they hadn't known they were looking for. What do you want? He said. I want to know what the Bauer collection was for. He studied her. That's what you want to know? Not money, not protection, not... I want to know what the system is for, Prudence said. I found the Luxembourg law firm. I found Straight Pacific Logistics. I found 4 separate consignments over 2 years with the same structure. You're not just moving forged art. You're moving something through the authentication process. The documentation, the provenance records, as if the art itself is secondary. I want to know what you're actually laundering. This time, the silence lasted long enough that she could hear the ventilation system cycling. You understood all of that, Luciano said, from 3 hours in the vault tonight, and your shipping manifests from the last 2 years, which are publicly available through the Maritime Registry if you know what you're looking for. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, You know what Bowen told me about you before I came here tonight? I have no idea. He told me that your supervisor has submitted 5 pieces of your work as his own in the last 6 years. He told me that you have flagged more suspicious consignments than any other authenticator in this building, and that 3 of those flags led to investigations that recovered stolen property, and that your name appears nowhere in any of the press coverage from any of those recoveries. He paused. He also told me that you take the Uptown 2 train every morning with a library book and a coffee from the cart on 72nd Street, and that you've eaten lunch alone in the break room almost every day for 6 years. Prudence did not let anything show on her face. That's a very thorough file. I am thorough, Luciano said, when something matters to me. The way he said it made the air in the room feel slightly different. She noticed it. She filed it away. The forged art, she said, was cover documentation for a series of financial instruments, bearer bonds, converted and moved through the auction records as part of the provenance chain. The art authenticates the paperwork, and the paperwork legitimizes the movement of capital across borders that would otherwise trigger regulatory review. She watched his face. That's it, isn't it? You're going to tell me, Luciano said quietly, how much of that you know for certain versus how much you just reasoned from the evidence. About 60% certain. The other 40 I'd confirm with the shipping manifests and a closer look at the valuation records in the consignment files. She paused. And I'd need access to the Aldgate capital account statements from the past 36 months. He looked at her. Why would I give you that? Because you have a problem, Prudence said. The Bauer collection was flagged, which means the method is compromised. If someone in law enforcement starts pulling on the same threads I pulled tonight, you have, at an estimate, 6 to 8 weeks before the pattern becomes visible to people with subpoena power, unless you restructure the entire documentation chain. She met his eyes, and restructuring a financial documentation chain built across 2 years and 4 jurisdictions is not something your security team can do, but you can. I can tell you exactly where the vulnerability is and how to seal it. I can also tell you which of the 14 Bauer pieces will survive professional scrutiny and which ones won't, and what it would cost to replace the failing ones with legitimate pieces that maintain the same valuation. She let the offer sit. And in exchange, he said, Hurricane Sable has been processing your consignments for 2 years. That means someone at the partner level was paid to look the other way. I want to know who, and I want documentation. Something moved behind his eyes. Why? Because I spent 6 years being dismissed in this building by men who were busy being corrupt, and I would like to watch that unravel in a very specific and legal way. For the first time, the corner of Luciano Cavallo's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who had walked into a room, expecting to find a problem, and discovered instead something that interested him profoundly. All right, he said. They worked through the night in the vault. Prudence had not planned to spend the night sitting across a work table from a man who was technically a criminal, while she audited his money laundering scheme for structural weaknesses. But she had also not planned many of the things that had actually happened in her life, and she had learned to adapt. Luciano didn't talk much while she worked. He watched, occasionally asking a precise question, and she found that she didn't mind the questions the way she minded most interruptions, because his questions were good. He understood the financial architecture faster than she expected, and when she explained the documentation chain to him, he didn't need her to repeat herself. Around 2 in the morning, he ordered food. She hadn't asked him to. He didn't ask what she wanted. He got the order from the late-night deli on the ground floor of the building and put a turkey club and a coffee on the table beside her without breaking her concentration, and she ate without looking up, and he didn't comment on it. At 3:47 in the morning, Prudence sat back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. The vulnerability is in the valuation interface, she said. When the documentation moves from the shipping record to the auction house's internal system, there's a 3-day window where the bearer bond references exist in 2 places simultaneously. If a forensic accountant knows as to look for that specific signature, they'll find it every time. She slid her notepad across the table. This is how you close it. Luciano looked at the notepad. Then he looked at, I've had 3 separate teams working on this structure for 18 months, he said. None of them found that. None of them were looking at it from the art side, Prudence said. They were looking at the financial documentation. The vulnerability is in the space between the 2 systems. It's easy to miss if you only know one of them. He was quiet. Your partner at Hurricane Sable, she said, in exchange. Luciano opened his phone and turned it toward her. On the screen was a bank transfer record, dated 14 months ago, and the receiving account was registered to a holding company that she could trace in about 11 seconds to a name she knew very well. Sterling Price. Prudence looked at the record for a long moment. I'll need a copy, she said. It's already in your cloud storage account, Luciano said, along with 3 years of correspondence. She looked up at him. When? About 20 minutes ago, while you were working. Something in his voice was very careful. Consider it a demonstration of good faith. She should have been more alarmed by that. She noted that she was not as alarmed as she should have been, and filed that observation away beside several other observations about Luciano Cavallo that she was not currently examining too closely. "The other 5 pieces," she said, "in the Bauer collection. You'll need to pull them before the senior team reviews them tomorrow. The forgeries are sophisticated enough to pass a standard review, but not a targeted one. I'll have them out by morning, and the Bauer consignment itself needs to be withdrawn. You can cite a dispute over the estate settlement. There's a legitimate legal mechanism for—" "I know the mechanism," he said. "I've used it before." "Of course you have." He looked at her, not with the measuring quality from earlier in the night. Something had shifted in that, somewhere around 2 in the morning, in a way she hadn't quite tracked. "You're not going to ask me whether what I do is wrong." "I know what you do is wrong," Prudence said. "I'm not confused about that, but the men who run this building have been stealing from me for 6 years, using methods that are technically legal, and no one has ever walked into a room at 8 o'clock in the evening and offered me anything in exchange for my work." She looked at the transfer record on his phone one more time. "So I'm making a pragmatic decision." "I'm not confused about that either." Luciano put his phone away slowly. "After tonight," he said, "what do you do with what you know?" "I submit a formal authentication report under my own name on the pieces that remain. I send the documentation about sterling price to the firm's ethics board and to the state AG's office. I take the credit I am owed for the Bauer analysis." She met his eyes. "And the rest of it, the structure, the mechanism, the names, goes into the 14-hour archive, which I will continue to update regularly. Which you and I both understand is the arrangement that keeps that archive from ever being sent." "Mutually assured discretion," Luciano said. "I prefer to think of it as a professional relationship with appropriate safeguards." He was quiet for a moment. "You planned all of this before I walked in." "I planned for several scenarios," Prudence said. "This one went better than average." Sterling Price was put on administrative leave 16 days later. The Ethics Board inquiry took 4 months. The State AG's office took 11. When it was over, Sterling Price had surrendered his professional certifications, repaid a significant sum to Harwick and Sable, and been barred from the fine art industry in New York State. The coverage in the trade press was thorough and somewhat merciless, and Prudence's name appeared in all of it, attached to words like meticulous and groundbreaking and long overlooked talent. She got a call from a partner at Harwick and Sable on the morning the news broke, inviting her to a meeting to discuss her future with the firm. She thanked him politely and said she would think about it. She was already thinking about something else. Luciano Cavallo had sent her a text at 7:43 that morning. Not through any channel that could be traced, on a phone number she had not given him. "The Meridian collection comes to market in 6 weeks. 32 pieces from a private estate in Lyon. The provenance documentation is going to need a very specific kind of review." She read it twice. "Are you offering me a job?" She typed back. "I'm offering you a role," he replied. "The distinction matters. What's the difference?" There was a pause, longer than she expected from a man who seemed to have an answer for most things. Then, "A job is something you do for someone. A role is something you own. You'd have final say on authentication, full access to the documentation chain, and compensation that reflects what your work is actually worth, rather than what Sterling Price decided you were worth." Prudence sat at her desk in the building, where she had spent 6 years being invisible, and read that message 3 times. "And the safeguards," she wrote, "remain exactly as we agreed," he replied. "I have a talent for arrangements that work well for everyone involved." She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the skyline. "Send me the Lyon documentation," she wrote back. She was not naive about what she had agreed to. She understood the nature of Luciano Cavallo's business, and she understood the nature of her own position within it. That she was, in some sense, a function of mutual interest, and that mutual interest was not the same as trust, and that trust was not something built in a single night in a vault over a turkey club and a provenance dispute. But she was also not the woman who had eaten lunch alone in the break room for 6 years while someone else put his name on her work. The Lion documentation arrived that afternoon, 32 pieces, full provenance chains, 3 separate valuation reports from European houses. She spread them across her desk, put her loupe in her pocket, and started at the beginning. She found the first anomaly in 40 minutes. She was on her 4th piece when her office phone rang. It was the front desk. A visitor for her, no appointment, name given as El Cavallo. She told them to send him up. When Luciano walked into her office, he looked around at the documentation spread across every surface, at the photographs pinned to the board behind her desk, at the 3 notepads open at different pages. "You've been at it 4 hours," he said. "I've flagged 2 definite forgeries and 3 probables," Prudence said, without looking up from the piece in front of her. "The Lion Estate documentation has the same Luxembourg law firm signature in the footer margin. Whoever put your system together is either very loyal or very stupid." She made a note. "Also, the valuation report on piece number 7 uses an exchange rate from 8 months ago, which means either the appraisal was backdated or whoever wrote it wasn't paying attention." Luciano crossed the room and looked at the piece on her desk. "You're going to tell me which 3 are the probables," he said. "Yes. And then I'm going to tell you what to do about all 5 of them. And you're going to listen, because the last time someone didn't listen to what I found, it cost them significantly more trouble than it would have cost to listen in the first place." He looked at her, not the evaluating look from their first meeting. Something that had moved past that, into territory she was still working out how to map. "The offer still stands," he said. "Full roll, your name on your work." "I know." She flipped to the next piece. "I'm already doing the job, Mr. Cavallo. We'll work out the paperwork later." "Luciano," he said. She looked up from the photograph in her hand. "If we're going to work together," he said, "you should call me Luciano." She considered him for a moment, the grey eyes, the stillness, the quality of attention that he brought to every room he entered that she had noticed from the first moment and had been carefully not thinking about since. "Prudence," she said. It was not the first time he had heard it, but it was the first time she had offered it, which was different. "Now let me finish the 3rd probable before you start reorganizing my notepads." He sat down across from her without another word. Outside the window, the city moved through the middle of an ordinary afternoon. 44 floors below, people with no idea of the weight of documents in this room went about their ordinary lives. Prudence Okafor picked up her loupe. There was work to do, and she was going to do it. And for the first time in 6 years, every piece of it was going to have her name on it. That was enough. For now, that was everything.